And Jennifer, you have an email question.
Yes, well, if I may. This email question is from our WMURGathered.com blogger. The question is, Democrats have vowed to weed out corruption in the federal government. A major source of corruption for both Democrats and Republicans are bribes in spending bills, sometimes referred to as earmarks. Would you vow, if elected president, to veto all bills containing earmarks? And Wolf, of course, earmarks the pork spending that sometimes gets added to legislation without anybody really knowing about it.
Well, let's ask Senator Dodd. What about that? Would you agree to give up earmarks for Connecticut if you had your way?
Thanks, Will, for the question here about that. Well, listen, first of all, as president here, we ought to be discouraging that behavior because it is a problem. Clearly, we're getting the budget is getting out of control as a result of those practices. But I wouldn't want to have a blanket approach to that. There may be some critical issues that occur, events like Katrina and other events where the Congress needs to respond. You haven't gone through the process before. I wouldn't want to put us in that kind of a rigid straitjacket. But clearly, when you're going beyond that, we need to have more discipline in the process. I've been a long-time supporter, offered one of the first pay-as-you-go budgets back some 23 years ago in the United States Senate for the question that came up earlier about specific policies and ideas. I think with rare exceptions, you ought to be able to have accounting for either the tax cut or the spending program and pay for them. We've gone on too long allowing for these things to build and grow, and the deficits are a problem. Dennis is right. $2.2 trillion of public debt being held outside the country. The good news is the Chinese are buying it. The bad news is the Chinese are buying it because it puts us in a very disadvantageous position when it comes to arguing against currency manipulation. So getting better control of our fiscal policies. Our fiscal policies ought to reflect our moral values. Our fiscal policies ought to be fair, they ought to be practical, they ought to be pro-growth, and they ought to be responsible.
Senator
That's
Gravel.
not happening when you have earmarks year in and year out and not having the kind of influence that would eliminate them except in those rare circumstances where you may need to have them.
Is it time to do away with these earmarks?
Totally. It's abominable. And the only way you're going to get rid of it is to give the president the line item veto. And of course, they're not going to give the president line item veto. What we need to do is change the entire tax structure. I want to point out that the Comptroller General of the United States invited all the presidential candidates to come in for a briefing. I went in for a briefing. He said there was only 2 other people that came in for a briefing. What the briefing he told us is that we have a fiscal gap on the order of $50 trillion. And you're hearing all this money is going to be spent to do all these great things? My God, don't believe a word of it. Follow the money. Well, you can't get all this money coming at you, millions of dollars from all the special interests, and think that they're now going to deal with solving the problems with special interests. Won't happen.
Senator Clinton?
Well, I think it's important to remember that 6 years ago we had a balanced budget and a surplus. And we did that the old-fashioned way by cutting spending and raising revenues. There is no free lunch. We're going to have to do that hard work again. Now, my point is, when it comes to the tax questions that were asked, the benefits from the Bush tax cuts have gone disproportionately to a very small percentage of Americans. And 10% of Americans have realized about 50% of the increase in wealth that has happened in this country in the last 6 years. We need to deal with the burden on the middle class. The alternative minimum tax has to be reformed, hopefully eventually eliminated. But I think it's important to point out that we have done this before, not in ancient history, but within our memory, and we can do it again once we have a Democratic president.
Thank you, Senator. We're going to go back to Jennifer in a second, but I know Congressman Kucinich really wants to weigh in.
We've been raiding the Social Security Trust Fund to $200 million a year, and they're all involved in this. Now, what do they say about it? You balance the budget by raiding the Social Security Fund of $200 million a year, and they're doing it now.
Congressman Kucinich, you want to respond to that?
I do, because we're looking at a process here in Washington that most of the American public isn't aware of. And that is these interest groups have such a hold on our country that right now they're headed to grab the oil of Iraq using our troops. Right now they're keeping a not-for-profit health care system in its place. Right now, they're keeping NAFTA in its place. I'm talking about a real change here that gives the American people a chance to recover their country totally and by moving away from the interest groups that unfortunately support some of my dear friends here.
Senator Biden.
10 seconds. If you want to do away with the interest group, go to public financing of elections. Let's cut through all this malarkey. That is the bottom line. As long as there are massive contributions pouring into the system, you're going to get these earmarks in the middle of the night that have nothing to do with the people's interest. So you want to do this, reform the system, make a public financing system. That will change the earmark.
Thank you, Senator. Let's go back to Jennifer.
Okay, well, if we have Ivy Merrill with us tonight. Ivy, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
You are a substitute elementary school teacher.
I am.
What's your question tonight?
Well, thank you for being here. Given that the circumstances in this country and in our world were essentially the same when you take office, what would be your top priority for your first 100 days?
Senator Edwards.
To travel the world, reestablish America's, I think my mic just came on, reestablish America's moral authority in the world, which I think is absolutely crucial. The other things become less important and subservient. We have huge issues here at home. We've talked about some of them tonight. Energy, global warming, what we do about the issue of health care in America, the poor, which we haven't talked about, unfortunately. But the single greatest responsibility of the next president is to travel the world, speak to the world about what real American values are, equality, diversity, and to lead